I don't know if you've been keeping score in our class, but for the last 3 decades, it has been the Democratic Party that has really been the dominant political force in American politics. Really, ever since Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932, the Democrats had enjoyed not only uh, what you might call being the majority party in American politics, but our political orientation, our talking points were much more in line with democratic ways of looking at the world as opposed to the Republicans. In the late 1960s, this is going to begin to change. I emphasize the idea that it's beginning to change. The reason why is that in 1968, Americans looked around and what they saw was a Democratic National Convention where you had police officers in Chicago that were beating up protesters and protesters burning the American flag, protesting not only the war in Vietnam, but America's foreign policy generally speaking. Students for a Democratic Society and other groups affiliated with them demonstrating on college campuses, talking about how evil America was, trying to get it to go back to doing what they considered to be the right thing in the world once again. You had all these hippie kids that we were talking about with the counterculture, taking recreational drugs and listening to angry rock and roll music. The civil rights movement had been radicalized partly through Vietnam, partly through the idea that progress is coming, but it's not coming nearly fast enough. You've got the Watts riots in '65, Newark and Detroit a couple of years later, and so the Democratic Party, which had really taken the lead with respect to civil rights reform, is seen as this party that's sitting by and watching the cities burn, not doing anything about it. All said and done, what you're seeing happening in 1968 is that Democratic coalition of voters that had existed from 1932 forward, it's beginning to break apart. And what it's really doing is it's beginning to set the stage for a political transition. Okay? Again, it's the beginning of this process. It's not a complete process. To really drive this point home, I want to talk to you about the presidential election in 1968. Now, we've talked about how, first of all, Lyndon Johnson was not going to run for president in 1968. This is part of an overall process known as the credibility gap. Vietnam's a big part of that. I told you about how the Democratic Party, largely speaking, is really a mess in the aftermath of Robert Kennedy's assassination. One former Democrat that ran for president in 1968 was the Democratic governor of the state of Alabama, a guy by the name of George Wallace. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because it was Wallace that had stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama after President Kennedy, had said he had planned to get serious about integration of American life, including university systems. Okay? Anyway, George Wallace ran on what we call a segregationist platform. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He also really appealed to working class white voters. And the brilliance of Wallace, and I use that word brilliance very, very loosely, but his brilliance, his political savviness, and his shrewdness as a politician was that he came up with what I call dog whistle politics, a way of saying things without actually saying them. He would talk about welfare queens, and typically what he meant was a woman of color living in the inner city, basically making a living having children out of wedlock. And it was a way of saying, if you're tired of your hard-earned white tax dollars going to individuals like this, then you need to vote for me because I'm going to do something about it. Now, the simple fact of the matter is Wallace was just too radical. The idea of a segregated America and a platform as such was simply too radical for average Americans to get behind. But one individual who, up until this point, thought that his political career was dead, that realizes that there is a lot of votes to be had. There's a lot of votes that are being taken for granted by the Democrats. That would be the former vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon puts together in 1968 a presidential campaign whereby he enacts what he calls his Southern strategy. And it's pretty simple, really. He campaigns heavily in the South because he realizes that not only is this democratic coalition breaking apart, Vietnam's a big part of that, but there's a lot of people in the South that are really, really upset with an expanding federal government that's beginning to tell private citizens you must serve this individual regardless of whether or not you on a personal level want to. Now, don't get me wrong, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act were really instrumental pieces of legislation, very necessary pieces of legislation to democratize America, small d democratize. But the simple fact of the matter was, if you've read books like Blood Done Sign My Name by Timothy Tyson, you know that there's an awful lot of resistance in the rural South to implementing those laws. So Richard Nixon's appealing to individuals, not necessarily out of racism the same way that Wallace is, but at the same time, he understands that the South is, it's open hunting season down there, to put it another way. Okay. Now, in 1968, Richard Nixon appeals to a group of Americans that he calls the silent majority. According to Nixon, these are individuals that are the non-demonstrators, they're the non-shouters, they're the non-flag burners, they're the non-city burners. They're the people that feel that we should be standing up to communism abroad, that we ought to stand for law and order, and of course we can agree that there are various police departments throughout the country that are racist, but that doesn't mean that you get to burn down American cities to drive your point home. Let me put it to you another way though. Really, what this silent majority is going to emerge into after 1968 is not only really a very important cornerstone of the Republican voting bloc, it's really going to be middle-class, white, suburban, moderate voters. So middle-class, white, suburban, moderate voters. They're essentially independents that tend to lean a little bit more conservative than they do anything else. But Richard Nixon's appealing to them directly, and later on, especially in the 1980s and beyond, those people are really going to become the bread and butter of the Republican Party, the same way that industrial workers and city dwellers had really been the cornerstone of the New Deal voting coalition from the 30s to the 1960s. In any case, what you begin to see is a Republican Party that for the first time in over 30 years is finally capable of competing with the Democratic Party on a somewhat even keel basis. Okay? And this is evidenced by Richard Nixon's election in 1968. He wins the election. So what I want to do next is I want to talk about the Nixon presidency. Okay, we're going to start out with his foreign policy because in a lot of ways Richard Nixon really is our last liberal president, and yes, I know he's a Republican. Hear me out. Richard Nixon campaigned on the idea of cutting federal social spending and really beginning to repeal some of those Great Society programs that had seen their start under Lyndon Johnson. The thing of it was, Richard Nixon understood that government has a role to play in our day-to-day life. There are government programs that, they might be costly, but they really do serve a good purpose, like higher education, for example. In any case, Richard Nixon came up with a concept known as New Federalism. And this really wasn't a reinvention of the wheel. Under the Great Society programs of the early 1960s, all this money would go into Washington, and the federal government would decide how the states would spend it on higher education, on road construction, on public works programs, and you get the idea. Under New Federalism, there really wasn't anything that changed vis-a-vis taxes. People still paid their taxes. It's just that Richard Nixon gave chunks of money to the individual states and said, look, Illinois, Texas, California, you're closer to the problem in your own individual states. And so you figure out how you want to spend this money. You figure out what the best way should be to allocate these resources. And so was it really anything that was radically different than what Lyndon Johnson was doing? Not really. It's just that it gave the sense that the states had more discretionary power this time around. But outside of new federalism, you have the emergence of other federal programs like the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. You call that OSHA. And if you've ever had a job, like in retail or maybe fast food, something like that, I'm willing to bet that there's a poster in the break room that's an OSHA poster. OSHA is the reason why if you work 4 hours, you get a 15-minute break. It's the reason why Walmart and Kroger and other big retailers are responsible for providing a safe and decent working environment. It's the federal government's regulation of the workplace, and it comes into existence on the Nixon watch. The Environmental Protection Agency, even though Nixon wasn't necessarily a big fan, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, come into existence in the Nixonian presidency. And what this is a regulation of the kind of pollutions that big corporations could crank out into the air or dump into the waters. The late 60s was a very polluted time period. I mean, you're talking about a time period where lakes would literally catch on fire because they had all kinds of chemicals dumped into them. And so the EPA is another example of the Nixon presidency that's not exactly a conservative's dreamboat president, but it is beginning to change things a little bit. But really, Nixon's liberalism, I guess you could call it, can be seen in his foreign policy. One of the things that Richard Nixon does to begin his presidency is he appoints a guy by the name of Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State. Now, Kissinger was a Harvard PhD, and he was an expert in international relations. And one of the first places that Nixon sends Kissinger, the Secretary of State, is to China, who's beginning to move on Taiwan. Now, basically what you've got here is the expansion of communism, communist China moving into Taiwan. And so ever since 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, this statement that we would fight any war if it meant standing up to communism, the easy thing to do is declare war on China and repel them back to their homeland. Nixon and Kissinger understand we can't afford another war. We're already bogged down in Vietnam. And so one of the things that Kissinger does is he strikes a deal with the Chinese communists. What the Chinese got was a seat at the United Nations table. This is the US and Britain and France formally recognizing in front of the entire world that China was a very important and a very powerful country and that we were going to treat them as a co-equal. What we got from China was them backing away from Taiwan. So we successfully stopped the spread of communism, and the best part was we didn't have to use one bullet to do so. So this was a really good thing that Nixon had done and Kissinger had done, and a lot of people, Democrats included, gave him quite a bit of credit for this. In addition to what's going on with China, Nixon actually also reaches out to the Soviet Union and signs what comes to be known as SALT I agreement. SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Later on in the Carter presidency, we'll sign SALT II, but in any case, what these SALT agreements are is an agreement between us and the Soviet Union to reduce the size of our nuclear arsenals. So the world's becoming a safer place to live under the Nixon presidency, and we're beginning to achieve something that historians call détente, a French term that means the relaxation of tension. But I always like to think about this time period as maybe a thawing out of the Cold War. You think of a real liberal president like Jack Kennedy that really ramped up the rhetoric, and that's in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, drawing a hard line with the Soviet Union. Nixon's really relaxing that line, and he's not necessarily rolling over, but he is reaching out to our enemies, and he's having a dialogue. We're having a conversation, which is a lot more than you can say for some politicians that have come before Richard Nixon. But let's be honest, I mean, we can have all the SALT agreements, all the China deals that we want to have, all the foreign policy marbles are over there in Vietnam. Now, Richard Nixon was elected in '68 more or less as the peace candidate. Keep in mind that Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee that year, said that if you elect me, I'm going to fight the war to a conclusive end. Richard Nixon campaigned in '68 on the idea of peace with honor. Now, what he meant by that is we're going to get out of Vietnam, which we all agree we want to end the war in Vietnam, but we're not just going to do so by waving the white flag and running back to Washington. That's not the way that we're going to approach this. Now, peace with honor was about as vague and as unspecific as Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was in 1932 on the campaign trail. Sure, it was a secret plan to end the Great Depression, or in Nixon's case, a way to end the war, but what did that mean aside from that? Well, after Nixon was inaugurated, we got a good, close, personal understanding of what he meant. What he meant was a process known as Vietnamization. Now, for your notes, Vietnamization is a process whereby South Vietnamese troops that had been trained and equipped by American forces would replace American troops in the fighting and the war in Southeast Asia. And so this was a really good thing as far as a lot of American people were concerned, considering once those Vietnamese troops were replacing American troops, it means the American troops can come home, okay? And so again, Richard Nixon's becoming a quite popular president. That's not to say that there's not any kind of controversy, especially with respect to Vietnam, in the Nixon presidency. In 1969, American forces descended upon this village in Vietnam called My Lai, or My Lai, however you choose to pronounce it. In any case, I've told you the very controversial nature in which Vietnam was fought with these search and destroy missions. Our mission is to go into the jungle, find the enemy, and kill them. The problem is, in a lot of cases, the enemy is using the civilian population as a shield and blending in to the population that way. So it's very possible to be looking into the eyes of your enemy and just simply not know it. And you can imagine what a nerve-wracking situation that is when you come across a village and you want to make sure that they're not harboring the enemy, or they're not the enemy, generally speaking. In the case of My Lai, it was a massacre in the sense that every man, woman, and child of that village was killed, and the village itself was put to torch. We court-martialed the commanding officer who claimed that he needed to destroy the village, I'm paraphrasing him, destroy the village in order to save the village. And so this has a massive deterioration effect on military morale, on civilian morale for the war, and it's also quite enraging to the anti-war movement once the word gets back home and you begin to see protests pouring across college campuses. One protest that turned tragic was the Kent State University protest. The National Guard had been on hand that particular event to make sure that nothing got out of order. As protesters approached the National Guardsmen, they were trying to make this peaceful gesture toward them. Shots rang out, and long story short, 4 student activists managed to be killed in what came to be known as the Kent State Massacre. If you're following along with me on the PowerPoint slide, if you're looking at that picture of the woman screaming in the streets there, that was the inspiration for the Neil Young song, Ohio. And if you listen closely to the lyrics of Neil Young's Ohio, you'll hear him talk about 4 dead in Ohio. He's talking about the Kent State Massacre. Okay. But back to Nixon and his Vietnamization process. Doing this was really going to de-escalate the draft. Keep in mind, those 12-month tours meant that a lot of people are going to be needed to be drafted in order to make up for the quick turnaround point when you get in and you get out. Now that you no longer need as many American warm bodies, you no longer need the draft the same way that you did under Lyndon Johnson. Well, keep in mind, middle-class kids in the suburbs being drafted is really what propelled the anti-war movement to unprecedented levels of notoriety in American life. The de-escalation of the draft really killed the anti-war movement's momentum, and it really made the New Left and Students for Democratic Society in particular desperate. They got desperate. An offshoot organization of this New Left was an organization that called itself Weather Underground. And Weather Underground felt that the mainstream of the movement just simply was not doing enough when it comes to stopping the government's ability to conduct the war. Think about Henry David Thoreau and not paying his taxes back in the 1840s with the Mexican-American War. This was, according to Thoreau, a way to stop the government's ability to conduct the war. Think about that, only replace nonviolent resistance with violent resistance. What Weather Underground decided that they were going to do was cripple the government's ability to conduct the war by attacking a vital resource within the military, and that would be the emerging field of computer science, which just so happened to really catch on at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And so Weather Underground bombs this computer lab at the University of Wisconsin, and one of the casualties is some poor graduate student that was there because he, like any other graduate student, wasn't being paid very much and was trying to feed his family. And so Weather Underground is really, really problematic for the student movement in the sense that they come across as violent. Later on, there would be, for lack of a better way of calling them, there would be philosophers that would say that the New Left essentially took the easy way out and committed political suicide by becoming violent. They abandoned organizing and they took violence into their own hands, and Weather Underground's bombing of the University of Wisconsin serves as a good point. All of this is leading us into the election of 1972, and by that time, Richard Nixon's quite a popular president. There were a lot of people that really respected what he was doing with China, what he had done with the Soviets, and the way that he was handling the Vietnam War. Nixon's running against a guy who might have made a lot of people feel pretty good, George McGovern. But the truth of the matter was McGovern brought in a lot of new people to the Democratic Party, women and racial minorities, but he wasn't any match for a seasoned, shrewd veteran of politics like Nixon. And Nixon makes short work of him in the general election, receiving more than 61% of the popular vote. Which really makes you wonder why it was that Richard Nixon was obsessed with the 1972 election. I mean, you don't get 61% of the electoral, well, not the electoral vote, but the general population's vote, and not know that you're in pretty good shape going into election night, okay? Richard Nixon always made it out as if he was completely oblivious to the anti-war movement and what they were doing with respect to their protests. He would always say that he was upstairs in the Oval Office watching a football game, and he didn't pay these people, bums he used to call them, in any mind whatsoever. Well, the simple fact of the matter was he was obsessed with the anti-war movement. He feared the anti-war movement and was very, very much wanting to suppress any kind of dissent as far as Vietnam was concerned. What really bugged Richard Nixon was a series of classified documents that had been leaked to the New York Times by the Edward Snowden of his day, a Pentagon insider by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg leaked several very damning Pentagon documents to the New York Times, and what the New York Times does with them is they bundle them up in a book, the Pentagon Papers, as it was called. And what the Pentagon Papers are is a scathing, highly secretive description of America's involvement in Vietnam up until 1967. Now think about this. Where is Richard Nixon in 1967? The answer to that question is in California, assuming that his political career is dead. This is not Nixon's war, which makes you wonder why he cared anything in the world about the Pentagon Papers. This is Kennedy's war. This is Johnson's war. This has got nothing to do with Richard Nixon. Well, LBJ was a very popular president, very powerful president, had won a very convincing election in 1964, much like Nixon in 1968. And Nixon felt, look, if it can happen to Johnson, being driven from the White House by this war, it can happen to me. And so he felt that he had to suppress any kind of leak from the Pentagon under his time in the White House. And who do you call when you have a leak? When your pipes are leaking, you call a plumber, right? Richard Nixon put together this presidential committee that came to be known as the Plumbers, and their job was to fix these leaks that were coming out of the Pentagon so that fewer and fewer people understood what was going on, or the highly problematic parts of America's involvement in Vietnam. At the same time, he starts an organization known as the Committee to Re-elect the President. If you sound out that acronym, what you get is CREEP. Okay? And what CREEP is doing is taking donations from very shady organizations, and I don't mean bad organizations. I just mean, where did this check for $50,000? Where did it come from? Um, the simple fact of the matter was there's a lot of things that were not exactly legal that were going on leading into the election of 1972 that Richard Nixon wanted to keep on the down low. Now, being the obsessive person that he was, what Richard Nixon thought or believed was at least a possibility was that the Democrats, even though they were a train wreck of a political organization in 1972, they had some scathing, smoking gun document that was very, very unsavory, shall we say, that maybe would have made Richard Nixon look really, really bad in the eyes of the American public. And so what happens in 1972 is four individuals, all of whom have direct connections to the president. They are all arrested for burglarizing the Watergate Hotel complex, which was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee for the duration of the 1972 election. Watergate, right? Now, what these individuals begin to do once they are arrested is they begin to implicate their higher-ups, ultimately leading to Richard Nixon. Now, at this point, Richard Nixon can claim this is a classic he said, she said situation. Says, I don't know anything about the break-in. I know that they are connected to me. I know this looks bad, but the simple fact of the matter is I didn't do this. I didn't commission this. Okay? Well, that was one thing, but it had become public knowledge that Richard Nixon had installed audio taping devices, recording devices in his office so that he would be able to go back and have those records on file if in case he never needed them ever again, meetings and whatnot. And so what a lot of the American public are doing is demanding that Richard Nixon release those tapes. And Nixon says, look, I'd love to, but the problem is I can't. There's top secret information on those tapes, and releasing them would really jeopardize the office of the president, so I'm claiming executive privilege, and I'm not going to comply. Okay? Now, there's an investigation that is probing this whole Watergate scandal, generally speaking, and it's leading more and more in the direction that Richard Nixon at least knew something about the break-in before the break-in actually happened. The Supreme Court actually went so far as to subpoena those tapes, ordering a 9-0 decision to force Richard Nixon to give up those tapes. Now, Richard Nixon's still claiming executive privilege at this point, and if you think about it, the president is the executive in chief. His job is to execute the laws. The Supreme Court's only job is to interpret the legality of those laws. There's no muscle behind the Supreme Court, so there's nothing from stopping Richard Nixon from saying, I'm just not going to release them. What are you going to do? Send your errand boy, your intern from Georgetown University? You're going to send him over there and demand that those tapes be released? Richard Nixon was the muscle. And so what happens after Nixon said that he was not going to comply with the subpoena is the people rose up. There were protests all across the country, but especially in Washington, D.C., that are calling for the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Okay? And the House of Representatives actually begins this process, failure to comply with the subpoena. They're beginning to introduce articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. And so once the American people rose up, the jig was up for Richard Nixon. And he resigned. He stepped down rather than face the music of impeachment, rather than having a court in the United States find out exactly what was on those tapes, knowing what he knew before the Watergate break-in. So Nixon has basically been driven out of office. The irony here is he was setting up the infrastructure, the political infrastructure within at least the White House to prevent himself from being driven from the White House from this war, or by this war. The Vice President, Jerry Ford, was sworn in the aftermath of Nixon's resignation. And one of the first things that Ford does is he pardons Richard Nixon. So it was one thing for the American people to learn in the most direct and vivid way that the government was lying. I mean, there's really no other way of saying it. Richard Nixon was lying and in a very deceitful sort of way. That was painful enough. But for Jerry Ford to just go ahead and say, I pardon him and he's not even going to have his day in court. That was a really, really difficult blow for American citizens when it comes to understanding what democracy is and, what accountability really means. Now, in the aftermath, there is a silver lining to this. In the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, we begin to implement reform measures that are designed to scale down executive power. There's a lot of people that are beginning to see the president, not just Nixon, but Kennedy and Johnson, behaving more or less as an emperor, like a monarch, rather than a democratically elected extension of the American people. We need to reform measures in American politics and get him back into line with respect to what the Founding Fathers had envisioned when they created things like the Constitution. Okay? And so in 1973, you get something called the War Powers Act that was designed to rein in the president's ability to deploy U.S. Forces without congressional approval. From now on, you need to go through Congress and you need to actually get a declaration of war. You can't just take the country into war willy-nilly. Okay? The Freedom of Information Act, it not only protected access to public records, it was designed to promote transparency, and not just at the federal level. If you wanted to know, for example, what your local library was spending money on, that's your taxpayer money that they're spending on whatever it is that they're buying. If you were to request a Freedom of Information Act question under the federal guidelines, they would be forced to tell you, look, this is our budget, and here's what we purchased in the last 12 months, and this is what we would like to purchase hereafter. It's designed to promote transparency. The Fair Campaign Practices Act of 1974, it limited and regulated contributions in presidential campaigns. You got to at least identify who you are when you make these donations, and you can only make so much donations to one particular candidate. Okay, you can't essentially buy a political campaign, if you will. The Federal Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978 prohibited domestic wiretapping without a warrant. You have to have a court that justifies the reason why you're going to tap somebody's hotel room or their home to listen in on private conversations. Now, all of these things are good. They're progressive in the sense that it's getting the president to act like the president and not some monarch anymore. The problem is that they're temporary. Think about what Snowden brought to light somewhat recently here, that the government is looking through our Google searches, or that the government's listening in on our private phone conversations, clear violations of our civil rights and our civil liberties. In time, future presidents would find ways to skirt the law. And I'm not picking on one person or another. You could start with Ronald Reagan and go all the way through Barack Obama, and there probably would not be any shortage of, an infringement upon some of these things that we're talking about. You've got Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United that has kind of reversed this idea of fair campaign practices, the idea that you don't have to identify yourself, or you can be extremely vague when you go ahead and make these contributions, like, the Society for Prosperity. I'm just making something up, but you see what I'm trying to say here. So this idea of, presidents really flirting with unconstitutionality, it's not something that's going to go away in the 1970s. It will be revisited in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and even in our temporary times that we're living in right now. It's something to think about with respect to, what we live in this day and age. That's all the time that we have for today. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the fallout of Watergate and the world of American American life in the mid to late 1970s.